All right, welcome back, everybody. We're very privileged this morning to be able to host Dr. Dan Kammen. Dr. Kammen is here mainly through the efforts of Carl Dans, who is one of the co-founders of the Silicon Valley North chapter. And Carl wanted to say a few words before Dr. Kammen will join us up here on the podium. So, Carl.
All right, thank you.
Take it away.
Thanks. All right, no, fantastic. So thank you very much, Mary. So I'm Carl Dans, Silicon Valley North chapter, and as many of you know, up until about a week ago, we were going to have Congresswoman Anna Eshoo standing up here shortly. And so a real special thanks to Dr. Kammen for jumping in at the last minute, and I'm actually thrilled that he's going to be with us this morning. And having said that, I did want to just share with you very briefly, I'm not going to read her whole letter, but Congresswoman Eshoo, this is the second year in a row. Some of you have seen this like deja vu all over again. A government shutdown precluded her joining us here. She put together a beautiful letter for us, and we'll make it available afterwards so you can read the whole thing. But I just wanted to capture a couple of key points here, and you'll see it's right up to the minute. Okay, she says, on January 24th, I joined Representative Ted Deutsch, the co-chair of the caucus, and 5 other members to reintroduce the Bipartisan Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. So she joined as an original co-sponsor on the reintroduced bill, which is just fantastic. Much like CCL's carbon fee and dividend proposal, this legislation establishes a $15 per ton fee on carbon emissions, which increases by $10 per ton each year. I love the fact she reads back to us the provisions of the bill each time. It's just fantastic. Revenue from the tax would be returned in equal shares to all adults with a valid Social Security number to offset the increased costs associated with the tax. So, I mean, this is how on board she is with us. She's a true champion. Meetings with her these days are essentially strategy sessions where we're figuring out, how do we get more Republicans on board? Who are the people that she can talk to? What should we as CCL volunteers be doing based on her 26 years of being in Congress? She's gained a lot of wisdom and has established herself as someone that works well across the aisle. So we're so lucky to have her as our Congresswoman, and we almost got her this year for the conference, but we'll see what happens next year. All right, so I just wanted to share that little bit with you because I think it's really important to recognize her contributions. So, and we'll make the whole letter available so everybody has a chance to read that. All right, well, without further ado, I do want to introduce Dr. Dan Kammen. He is a professor at UC Berkeley, jointly in the Energy Resources Group, where he directs the Center for Environmental Policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy and in the Department of Nuclear Engineering. He is the founding director of the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory and directed the Transportation Sustainability Research Center from 2007 to 2015. And of course, we love the fact that he is on the advisory board of Citizens Climate Lobby. So without further ado, Dr. Dan Kammen. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here because this is definitely the fight of all of our children's lives. So every minute you can spend on this is a huge down payment on the future. So thank you all for being here. Well, it's a real pleasure to get to be here. I'm sorry that Anna isn't here, but I'm also delighted that there's at least 3 weeks of open government, and we'll leave it at that, I think, for a start. So my goal today is to really bore you all for 5 minutes and then hopefully get people excited after that. And by that, I mean, I want to just highlight a little bit of the positive news on what's happening around thinking more sensibly about energy and climate issues. and lead that into looking at what are some of the things that have really worked well, because I think one of the hallmarks of what Citizens Climate Lobby is doing, and in particular with this bill, is working exceedingly hard so that there are pro-climate, pro-clean energy elements in it to really bring people together. And if President Obama said, if one line sort of really highlights him, maybe it's the hope picture, but I really think it was what he said before that when he said there's not Democratic Americans and there's not Republican Americans, there's Americans. And I want to be president of all Americans. And I think that's really the point that, in my view, was the most telling piece of his rise. And I'm hoping that what comes out of this bill will be a version of that as well. And that is, there are elements, no matter what your technological interests, no matter how your politics go, that mean that you can get behind something which seems to the rest of the world like yesterday's news. That we should all have already gotten behind this and make progress on a clean environment. And this bill is a critical part. And as the handout you all have note, this bill alone does not solve climate change, but it's a huge step forward, and things that we did not think were possible in the good and the bad way 20 and 10 and 5 years ago are proving to be possible now. And so we need to really highlight the good side of that equation, not just the dangerous side. So I'll do a minute or two introduction to my laboratory group at Berkeley, because it plays into many of the cases, and we've played a role in a number of California and federal and some international policies that are good, we think, good models for where we're going. But I hope that'll be an introduction to where we're after, and then I'll talk about how much the energy system is in transition, highlight a little bit of how and why we need to innovate for the climate, for a clean and safe climate, and then really wrap up with why that pulls together into what our group and many others are increasingly calling the just transition or the equitable transition. I'll get to that just at the end and for a couple words. So just an introduction to our laboratory. It's a fairly large research group for a university. It's also one that has a mixture of students, postdoctoral fellows, and visitors who are strongly focused on basic science and technology, some on applied science, some on economics, some on rhetoric. But it's a group where almost everyone who joins is as equally dedicated to new innovations as they are to being an activist in various ways. And so there's a whole bunch of features you'll see that I think kind of illustrate the way in which we try to work the science that we feel we need to get better understood to really make a difference on climate protection. And if anyone wants to track any of the things on our lab, the website is the top, RAIL, Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. Don't just write down RAIL, because if you Google that, it turns out the #1 promoted thing, because Google never would promote based on pay or anything, is the Railians, who claim to have cloned a human 10 years ago in Florida. Haven't heard much from them since, but if you put in RAIL and Berkeley or energy, you'll get to this site. And then we do tweet on my Twitter, roughly 1 tweet a day about the projects and the prospects, and today's tweet will therefore be something from this meeting. So I'll look for the right picture and put it up later on in the day. In terms of the lab, it was founded 20 years ago when I moved to Berkeley with really this eye to work on energy innovations and science towards a policy direction. Our first set of projects was really wonderful. Back in '96, I started working with the IPCC that, of course, just released the 1.5 degree climate report. We got a nice plaque in the mail. But those of you who read this great book, Losing the Nobel Prize, around the rules of the Nobel Prize, know that Nobel Prizes can only be given to 3 people at most, and that's a historical tradition. Because there were around 480 of us who took part in the effort that ultimately resulted in the Nobel Peace Prize for the IPCC, everyone was in a quandary. What do you do? We didn't get a check. Unfortunately, got a nice plaque, got a nice trip to Scandinavia. But the real challenge, for those of you who've been on both the Berkeley and Stanford and some other campuses, is that while the check is great and the award is nice, there's a higher level of reward that you get at US universities. And that, of course, is parking, right? And if you go around any US university, you will generally see parking places with a big NL, Nobel laureate, on them. So I was like itching and ready to get my parking place. I was so excited. First year, 2007, nothing happened. 2008, 9, 10, nothing happened, nothing happened, nothing happened. Finally, a year and a half ago, almost 10 years out, they said, we're going to do something about it. And we did. We finally did get the parking space. I was so excited, and it arrived. So not only is it Nobel laureate bike parking, but the fine print, as is true of many state universities, is critical, not reserved for those who contributed. So it's a very Berkeley response to a nice feature. But it does illustrate some of what's going on. Over the years, we've tried to really hash out some of the science and some of the economics of a whole variety of features, one of which is called PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy, and it's basically to facilitate municipalities to lend money to property owners so they can invest in energy efficiency and in renewable energy, and that's worked quite well. It had a very tortured past, largely due to then Secretary of Treasury Geithner, who didn't want to so-called put homes more underwater by adding debt to them. Little did he know that homeowners that invest in energy efficiency and in solar are far better credit risks than most homeowners. So PACE is now in operation. It's taken a long time to get there. And one word I went over quickly, we'll come back to at the end, and that is, it's a good policy. I'm a big fan of it. We helped write it, but it's for property owners. And that means it is inherently inequitable. It means we all subsidize those who already have property. And then I'll come back to this last point about a just transition, and it's why I'm so excited about some of the bills that are coming out now. Another thing we do in our laboratory is to partner with governments around the world to think through how they can change their energy system. We started in California, Chile, Nicaragua, Mexico, China, Kenya, Uganda, now Nepal, a number of others, Morocco, where we work with them to think through how that transition would play out in terms of how much do they have to invest in new transmission lines, energy storage, energy access programs for the poor. And this is really where we need to go, because as much as California is on a good path, there are going to be some bumps, and Danny Cullenwood will talk about a few of those later on. We have a reasonable strategy, at least in California. We hope this bill is the first step towards a major push for the US, but this is a global story because California is barely 1% of global emissions, and so we can get our house in order, but it's got to be a larger and larger partnership. Starting in Washington, D.C. would sure help, but we need to expand beyond that pretty rapidly. So in terms of thinking this process through, one of the hallmark moments, in my opinion, is when President Obama and Premier Xi signed this agreement 1 year in advance of the Montreal Protocol, of the Paris meeting, maybe it's too early in the morning, of the Paris Accord. And the US and China said something fascinating. They said we would do a two-party deal, the G2, if you will, of climate. After all, the United States and China, 40% of energy consumption, 40% of pollution. If we cut a deal, we don't need to wait for 180 or 190 countries to agree. We'll go ahead. That deal was brilliant, and it was also a political sort of confusion because the US said they would do something, cut our emissions by 33% by 2025. And China said something totally different. Not even the same year, it was considered an asymmetric treaty. China said they would peak their emissions, so for the engineers in the room, the slope would go to zero of their emissions curve, but didn't say when it would be. And I had political science friends calling, this is an outrage. You can't agree to something where they said they'd peak. Maybe they'll peak at 2 times their current level, maybe 100 times. That's a horrible deal. Well, in fact, as you know, now the U.S. has reneged on its partnership in the Paris Climate Accord. The climate plan that President Obama set up has been canceled, and in fact, China is now forecast to peak its emissions ahead of schedule before 2030 and at a level much lower than almost anyone else thought. And so unusual, unconventional deals can really make progress. We now need to catch up. And we now need to catch up because if you look at the business as usual emissions trajectory, and if you look at the US and Chinese share, it's quite clear we don't reach climate goals unless the US and China get on board. Right now, China has a range of problems, but domestically, we can talk in the questions about their international policy, But domestically, China is doing a remarkable job, much quicker than anybody thought. The US, that looked like we were on a good path, now we need a little help from you all. So of course, this is what that means in terms of emissions, that business as usual is the red line, warming the planet by 4.5 degrees or more. But after the US and China agreed to this historic statement at the 2014 APEC summit, and then countries really got on board, they glommed on in a huge way, the commitments made in Paris, not that we've done them yet, would cut out all of the red. They would remove all of that top part of the emissions picture here, leaving a roughly equal amount to go. So this is what we've committed to. We think we know how to do. No one's really done it yet. This is what we have to still keep innovating on, investing, bringing out more companies, more research groups, putting public-private partnerships into practice, passing new laws. But the excitement of Paris did something else. And that was that everyone got on board with saying we don't just need to do these commitments, we don't just need to invest in new innovations, but let's find other areas where we can move ahead. The first of those happened 6 months after the Paris conference. Gets almost no press, but in Kigali, Secretary of State Kerry, my former boss's last job, was to pass the so-called Kigali Accords. These are mainly on CFCs and other industrial emissions, but those are passed and agreed on everyone. Now the US is out of that, but we're the only country out. And those in total, if we carry through, would cut out about half of our total needed reductions, leaving this large chunk to go. Now those of you who are experts in the field know that Paris was all about reaching the 2-degree target. We've already warmed by 1 degree, so we have very little headroom left. But the exciting new development from the IPCC was their October 2018 report saying that we need to not get to 2 degrees, but 1.5 degrees, the so-called high ambition coalition. And you don't have to be too fancy reading the graph to know that if 2 degrees is here, 1.5 degrees means we will need to suck carbon out of the air in some form. We will need to go carbon negative at some point in our future. And the worry about this process is that if you look at that history of emissions, this is a paper I was a co-author on with Cristina Figueres and many others, and she was the chair of the climate process until just last year. As we go and as we delay action, the peak gets higher, and that's a worry. But for me as a scientist, the bigger worry is the slope of the line coming down gets steeper. And that's the worry, in my view, because the line here in blue, or whatever that color is 3% drop per year, sustained for decades. That's 4% and 5%. Doing it 1 year is one thing. Doing it year after year after year means innovating and investing and correcting your mistakes year after year. And the problem is that at its best, California achieved 3% reduction for about 6 years. And China achieved about 3% reduction for about 5 years. And those are the 2 fastest pieces of this we've ever seen. So when we start talking about decades needed, every bit of delay pushes this job from impossible, from very difficult to even more very difficult to very difficult squared, then cubed, and then close to impossible. And so time is our biggest enemy in this process. So thinking about what makes you optimistic, you have to go back to a graph that almost every California lawmaker involved in this has tattooed somewhere on their body. And that is this historical graph of electricity used per person in California going back to the 60s. We look roughly like the rest of the country. This, of course, is the OPEC crisis. OPEC was about oil, not electricity, so the experts will say, well, why? Because if your oil goes out of the economy or gets very expensive, you slow down the economy. The US slowed down. California took a dip, but California formed the Energy Commission and really set up a bunch of activities to move us forward. And since then, California has done the previously unthinkable. California, by investing in industrial, commercial, and residential savings on energy, has kept energy use per capita flat for decades. In the 60s, everyone thought, if you want to grow the economy, energy use must grow. And this was a total right turn from that. But of course, it's not such a simple story because California, since the 70s, we do have a lot more capitas. And so we have grown in overall energy, but per capita, we've done this remarkable thing. And that really gives us excitement and pleasure. And it sort of propelled me to work at the State Department as science envoy in a number of capacities to work with other countries. There we are with Secretary Kerry and some colleagues. It's Ann Carlson from UCLA, for those who feel it's too Northern California biased. And it was a great time. We got a lot done. It's really wonderful to get a letter at the end of your service really highlighting the degree to which you partnered. In my case, I partnered with North African and Middle Eastern countries in working on their climate plans. And you see a lot of really exciting innovations. And some of those started as quite humble efforts here. Here's something we started 10 years ago in California that was just passed into law 6 months ago. And that is, after 2020, which is now pretty soon, every home in California must be carbon neutral. That is remarkable. And that's a mixture of the advancing technology of energy efficiency, the improvement of solar cells, although solar isn't the only option, but for most California homes, solar is likely to be the main piece of that. And now we have this kind of panic mode where home developers and builders who ignored this process for much of the decade, thinking it would never happen, it was too far off, it was impossible, now have less than a year to figure out what are they going to do. We're getting homes that are coming up for approval and new home developments that have solar as a base option on the homes that you would buy for new homes. There's efforts on what happens when homes change hands. And interestingly, in areas where solar is not feasible because of clouds or trees or something, you're getting some very clever deals to perhaps have neighboring big box stores host solar. Your property has a share of solar on that roof or a share of a wind turbine or whatever other technology. So you're getting some interesting financial deals in the panic to make this happen. This is a good thing. When we did this, people thought it was impossible. Now it seems very possible. And how many solar rooftops in the audience here? That's impressive. I wish I had a picture of that. But we also passed something else which people thought was crazy on steroids, and that was by 2030, every commercial roof also has to be for a carbon neutral building. And people said that's not possible. These are many floors, lots of energy. So now we've got 11 years to figure out how do we get this done. And so it's an exciting process, and it's exactly these innovations that spread into the housing industry, construction internationally, and they're critical to find the ways to make this happen that will go along with passage of new bills. The other feature is, of course, that California, as you all, I hope, know, passed this fall Senate Bill 100, 100% clean energy by 2045. This is remarkable. This is what I think is the absolute cornerstone of where we're going to go down the road. It's 100% clean energy defined around carbon, so it's a very inclusive, it's a technology neutral look at where we're going, and it's got a lot of wonderful features, and Senator De Leon has just did a remarkable job working with both sides of the aisle to really get this through. One of the features is that California's RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, states that we needed to be 20% clean energy by 2010. We missed that target. We threw a party. We promised to do better. We hit that target 3 years late. Our 2020 target is 1/3. We're already over that. We will probably end 2020 somewhere around 36 or 37%. That's amazing. California's 2030 target was 50%, but with the passage of SB 100, things have now changed. It's now 60%. Amazing goals to put in place, and we are seeing a lot of activity that I think will get us right there. So we need to innovate. We need to invest. We need to get private sector, public sector all thinking about it. This is probably the most complicated graph I ever want to show. This shows the best efficiency of a whole range of solar technologies. Each color is a different kind of technology. The traditional crystalline ones are up here. New organic and quantum dot, perovskites, all kinds of cool emerging things are down here. you'll notice there's a slope, there's kind of an average rate of improvement, and thank goodness, the newer entrants are improving more quickly. It's an exciting process. It shows that there's a diversity of research. There's a lot going on in terms of looking at new solar, and solar is not the only one doing this. In fact, this process of seeing improvement is summarized essentially by something called Moore's Law, that we see technologies that you can mass produce and scale improving year after year. And if we look at the famous version of this cost curve for solar, what we see is that since the 70s, when electricity from solar was 50 cents per kilowatt hour, about $5 a watt, it's steadily improved year after year. It's a nice straight line down. You can basically bank on it, and we do. We often invest in programs to subsidize the technology early because we want to get that long-term savings over time. Solar is now so amazingly cheap that essentially everyone was wrong. We now see solar projects going in at under 3 cents a kilowatt hour. When this project happened in Abu Dhabi, I got calls saying, oh, it must be some strange deal in the desert, the land was free, or who knows what. Well, maybe, but Saudi Arabia and then New Mexico and Mexico have now brought in solar projects under 2 cents per kilowatt hour. Amazing. Game changer, but I heard there is one little problem. We still have this thing called nighttime, right? So one of the features about nighttime is that solar isn't really useful then unless you can store it. So now one of the questions is, can we make energy storage, pumped hydro, compressed air, new chemical storage, flywheels, disks, all kinds of things, so that we can get them cheap enough so you can install your renewables and storage and have 100% available renewable energy. So these learning curves come back into play. These are historical learning curves. There's solar, there's wind, there's combustion controls on power plants, ethanol. There is this little challenge here, and I'm a professor of nuclear engineering, and nuclear in the US has shown if these are learning curves, I can only call this, I guess, a forgetting curve. That's not what it is. This is due to complexity and regulation, but it says that while nuclear could be a player, although it's illegal in California, we're going to have to see the next generation of plants change around. To me, the biggest feature of showing change in this area is having lots of competing technologies. That complex graph of solar shows you all kinds of different players. This is the very early curve for batteries. We have lithium-ion batteries, like in our phones and laptops. We have lead acid, like in our cars. We have all manner of technologies, and they are showing the same behavior. So if we keep investing by putting money on the R&D side, the federal or state job, and if we buy those technologies, electric vehicles, who in the audience does not have a cell phone, a laptop, or an EV? If you have none of the above, raise your hand. That means you are investing as demand pull for some of the technologies. But I bet none of you have a flywheel spinning around storing energy, and I'll show you, I'll go 1 minute over to show you a picture of those. Here is an example of an energy storage plant contracted by Southern California Edison that is powered by solar. It is a liquid battery. It's called a flow battery. Unlike your phone, that you generally get ticked off of your phone after about a couple years because it degrades in its performance, flow batteries don't have thousands of cycles like your laptop or phone have. They have millions of cycles. And Southern California Edison is buying this to meet their mandates to have storage online. The other exciting feature is that if you look at what it costs to drive your EV, gasoline maybe 14 cents a gallon, hybrid cars drop that in half. If you buy your electricity for your EV, maybe 3 cents. But for those prices I just showed, we will now be able to drive operationally at less than 1/10 the cost of buying gasoline. California has a goal that we thought was impossible of 1 million solar rooftops. We'll probably make that goal. California has a goal that was also considered impossible of 1 million electric vehicles. We're about 400,000, so we need a lot of EVs to be bought during the coming year, technically 2 years because it's to the end of 2020. But this is the demand pull that tells lawmakers and industry that we will buy these technologies because they're better. Green comes as a benefit. And with this new bill, as it gets into Congress for the debate, we're going to need people from every walk of life, from every business sector, to highlight what are the benefits of energy efficiency, of solar, of investing in large station plants, because this green energy transition is not going to happen unless we really see the benefits of going this direction. And there are amazing new vehicles and features on the horizon, but all of this is the story of that transition. Now, the last thing I want to say, and I'm going to go over a second to say it, is the following. And that one of the challenges is that solar is rightly seen as a technology far more installed and available for the rich. So we used Google's data of 60 million rooftops to track all the solar in the United States. And in fact, what you see, unfortunately, is the slide I'll end on, is right there, is that even when you control for income of neighborhoods, solar is 30 to 40% more common in dominant Caucasian neighborhoods and 30 to 70% less prevalent even when you control for income in low-income areas. That is the horrible part of the story. We will not get there if this is not an equitable or just transition. So the thing I want to leave you with is that we talk about California's climate law, SB 32, because of its climate goals. But I'm going to predict that if we make this climate transition happen, and we really do invest in our future, the feature of California's SB 32 that we will all look back and be most proud of is not the climate goals. Lots of states and countries have them, but California's is the first law in the world that requires 35% or more of the cap and trade revenues must be spent on minority and disadvantaged communities. And I think that's the feature that our lawmakers deserve the biggest credit for. They made the climate transition into a climate and social transition. I want to thank everyone who contributed to those here, and I look forward to some conversations. So thank you all for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Doctor. This has just been fantastic. I came in here optimistic and encouraged. I'm even more so now. I learned a ton just now, so thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and there are microphones at the front of each aisle here. And I would ask you to keep it short and have it actually be a question, if you know what I mean. All right. So thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you. Little low there. Maybe pass you mine.
Testing 1, 2, there we go. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Okay, nuclear slide that you skipped, I'd love to hear your spiel.
So let me just say it to keep us going. So nuclear is in this interesting and challenging position. It is technically illegal to build new nuclear in California. We are closing our last nuclear plant somewhat early, Diablo Canyon, but the legal issues are not the challenge. Right now, nuclear is incredibly expensive relative to the alternatives, and nuclear today does not work very easily in markets where we're buying and selling power just a few days or weeks ahead of time. Those are not necessarily long-term challenges. There's neat work out of MIT recently about nuclear reactors that can follow loads much more readily. There's a whole bunch of opportunities. But the massive price tag means, unfortunately, that we don't build very many, as we know. And the real challenge is that of the 420-some nuclear power plants anywhere in the world today, all of them will need to be retired in the next 3 decades. End of life. Nuclear is on a pace between now and 2030 globally to build perhaps 55 to 60, if you're optimistic. We're going to lose 400. Building 60 is not a recipe to become that bigger player. So we will need the new generation of nuclear technologies. Maybe not. We will need new companies TerraPower, NewScale, Boston Fusion, all of these near-term and farther-term technologies to come into action and be able to give us those same kind of learning curves where different technologies, different companies compete so the nuclear can play a role in that world. Because right now, with the limited number of pressurized and boiling water reactors, we neither have enough reactors in the queue. And these are just a couple names of these companies. This shows the planned retirements. This shows conventional fission reactors. I actually personally believe, as an editorial comment, that I wish I could hang on until 2070 to see if I'm right or wrong. I don't think it's going to happen. I would predict the world will be 100% powered by fusion in 2070. Just half of it is 93 million miles away. We call that the sun. And half of it are plants that we built since then. But that's out of the range of your question. So that's really where I see the mix on nuclear right now.
Hey, so I live in a house in San Jose, and I rent that house, and there's not solar on the roof, and there is no financial incentive for my landlord to put solar on the roof. How do we fix that?
So this is a great question. This gets exactly to this just transition. There's a bill that has been worked on. It did not get all the way up last time in the California Assembly, but the idea is to enable what are called solar gardens, meaning that two things can happen. One is solar can be hosted off-site. A number of apartment buildings do not have ideal roofs due to mechanicals on them for solar. Some of them do. But the idea is you would host solar, and it can become part of the deal. The complex part is finding a way to incentivize the building owner and the renters, so they both share in the benefit. And that's been the sticking point in terms of how do you pass the benefits through, but also incentivize the homeowner, the building owner, to invest in the solar upgrades. I hope that bill will come around again in this cycle in California politics, but it's been challenging, mainly because the legal issues around it are complex, but it's one of the things that the state's working on. So great question.
Just to add, hosted solar will probably start fewer forest fires from long lines, but I'm really here to ask about what you think about how SB 32 will meld with the new federal bill that's being proposed now.
So just on the first point, as you all sort of saw from the 15-month investigation for a recent fire, it indicated that private equipment caused it, not PG&E. That's going to play interestingly into the bankruptcy issue. And it's true that solar plants are unlikely themselves to cause fires, but it's also true that large solar in far-off areas have the same need for transmission. And so this is a feature that I would say is technology neutral. If you have the need for lots of transmission, and we have a world that is warming, we're going to have to worry about this. And this is a partisan plug on my part, but I actually think that it's going to be very difficult to move ahead if we decide that utilities are going to be the place where we dump all the blame for climate change. That is a non-workable worldview in my view. So on the question itself on SB 32, and the federal legislation, I really don't see these as actually occupying the same space. California's bill is a mixture of sectoral regulations and our carbon price, and there's no reason why California would back off on its quite modest in-state carbon price if we get the federal one in place. But that's a story that the legislators will look at, but I really see these as complementary. And we've had a number of times in the recent past when good or bad things happened at the federal level, and California chose to stay the course, not to back off and wait for federal action, to keep being a leader, both because we know what's at stake, but also because California has profited very handily by being a leader. Roughly 40% of venture capital money in the US in the clean energy space passes through California. So the challenge in some ways is not for us. It's going to be hard here. California never does politics simply, I understand. And when you mix energy and water and land, it gets even worse. But California is in a benefited spot. By being an early leader, we have the jobs, we have the Silicon Valleys. The challenge is what happens in the 10th or 15th or 20th or 40th state when much of that benefit is there. We're going to need to partner in generous ways with the rest of the country, or this transition won't happen.
The tech,
Quickly, just before the next question, could the panelists for the next session please make their way backstage? Thank you.
Thanks.
The
I'll go much quicker answers. My apologies.
the technology exists for the average homeowner, or for the utilities, to adapt a system that would allow the average homeowner to produce unlimited energy into the grid at by being provided a profitable rate of return, just as the large solar farms receive. And so it's called feed-in tariffs in Europe. And so California could adopt that, especially with the PG&E issue right now and restructuring. So by doing that, an individual would be able to provide an unlimited supply.
I have to jump to the question part.
Yeah, and so the question is, what's happening with something like that?
Yeah, so you're right. Feed-in tariff is basically you provide a payment back to anyone who has a rooftop to sell power back in. I'd be shocked if California goes the feed-in tariff route for a variety of reasons. California hopefully will go to a full version of net metering, which simply means your meter, which if you have solar, tracks what you buy and what you sell, and there will be likely a wholesale rate, not a feed-in tariff, not a bonus rate, but there will be a rate for selling power back in. And if we're clever and we start to meld in parts of the so-called feed-in tariff, we would do something where the cleaner the power you put in, the more you're benefited. But you're absolutely right. The first part of the question or comment was exactly on. We have the technology to do so. We have to choose to do so.
Because net metering now limits what you can get back.
I couldn't say, but we have to move on. I didn't get the second part of that.
Well, I just said net metering only allows to get a return for what you use.
Well, but technically, if you really go back into the regulation, net metering is about recording it, and you could be given a benefit. You could be paying and buying power at the same time. So the term that is more common right now with the PUC is so-called prosumer. You're a producer and a consumer, and you should be benefited and charged based on the amount they use. California does, however, have this plan to base how we buy power on how clean it is, something called the loading order. And so there are some elements that could work into this. There's no technical reason why we couldn't do it. It's going to be a question of PUC and state legislatures.
Thank you.
Two questions, hopefully quick. One is that the various laws you said that are shooting for net zero energy for new construction. Is that net zero energy only referring to electricity, or is there any reference in that to
Yes.
to gas and heating?
No, so technically, as written now, it's just for electricity. There's lots of complications about the other features. One of the things that is challenging is that in California, gas is the dirtiest form of power that we permit. And even here, we do not actually take into account all the leaked gas. And if your gas system leaks more than about 2.5% a year, and we observe many in the country that do, it's actually as dirty as coal. Not on particulates, but in terms of greenhouse gases, because of all the gas lost in the system. So there are some huge challenges, but the rule you're referring to only refers to electricity so far.
Okay, so other question is, as someone who's had a solar system for about 18 years now or so, whenever I see the ads for, getting a cheap solar install, when I've talked to people, they said, well, but if you already have one, we can't really get you a rebate for upgrading or replacing. So I was curious if there's anything on that, because mine doesn't do much right now.
So there is nothing I know of to update that. I do know of some homeowners who have sold their solar on the secondary market and then reinstalled. But to be totally honest, I have solar that I put in 15 years ago, maybe similar to yours, and I actually do think that those credits that exist for solar should really go to new solar installers. So I feel like I've benefited once, but that's a personal statement.
Okay, thanks.
Let's do one last one and then wrap up. And I'm going to have you hold the mic. So we really...
Thank you for coming. I'm a graduate of Cal, so it's good to see somebody from Cal down here. You pointed out how renewable energy is coming down in price. Could you comment on what you think needs to be done to the grid, the electric grid, to further that along.
Yeah. So actually, the question before you about net metering and feed-in tariffs was really a question about that. The grid that we have now, no surprise, designed decades ago, was really designed to be a one-directional system. Send power from big power plants to demand centers. And we need to basically take advantage of the technology that we all carry around to make that grid smart. We need to sense the quality, the power level on a line. We need to sense, is this home or neighborhood at this moment a net importer or exporter? And that process is underway. It is far too slow. The Department of Energy has a wonderful office, the Office of Electricity, started under President Bush II. And that office needs to be ramped up dramatically and to move on from doing a few limited city trials in San Diego and Cincinnati to really national rollouts of smarter systems so that we can take advantage of this hardware. And that is really the modernization. The grid, however, is very difficult to rebuild. Any transmission line is going to be fought at multiple local levels, whether you're a NIMBY or a YIMBY or a BIMBY or all these different versions of this. We're going to have to build some lines if you want to generate large central station renewables. If we think the future is all small and distributed, it's a different story. But if we want a mix of large secure plants and distributed energy on our rooftops, on the rooftops of low-income projects like Grid Alternatives, one of California's real gems in this area does, and commercial plants, we're going to need to do exactly what you said, and we're way behind. When I go to Europe, they just laugh and say, "Are you serious? Your grid, you still use checks and you have grids, old grid? There's something wrong." So thank you all so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, Dan. We appreciate it.